Good morning from New York City. I am very excited about today's episode. It is a conversation with my friend, author, and journalist, Sarah Forton. Sarah is the author of the best-selling book, The House of Gucci, which was made into a major motion picture last year. It was directed by Ridley Scott and starring Lady Gaga and Adam Driver. If you didn't see that, you must have been under a rock. It certainly got lots of hoopla in the international press. It was a very interesting, important full circle moment because that book was written over 20 years ago. And it thrust Sarah back into a different chapter of her life, and it was really fun to witness and to be part of. In her current iteration, Sarah is an investigative journalist with Bloomberg News. She's an antitrust expert, and she today leads the Washington-based coverage of the federal court system, the Supreme Court, and the Justice Department. If you'd like to learn more about Sarah, you can follow her on Instagram, Sarah Gay Forden, or on sarahgayforden.com. So yes, she's a heavy hitter professionally, yet underneath it all, she's my beloved friend of 30 years. We have shared a lot of life together. Both of us were in Italy over 20 years. And over our long friendship, we've shared countless meals and friends. And I gave her baby shower for the birth of her daughter, Julia. We've shared job promotions and divorce and the loss of parents and moving back to the United States after having lived abroad for over 20 years. So we start our conversation with Sarah sharing a couple of nuggets about her personal life. And we move into talking about how her childhood and her creativity inform her work as an investigative journalist. We talk about the connective tissue of the various chapters of our life. We talk about clues and formulating good questions and cultivating an awareness practice. I hope our love and respect for each other comes through. Without further ado, let's move into the wonderful conversation I had with my dear friend, Sarah. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning.
I'm so happy to have you here with me this morning.
It's wonderful to be here with you.
You ready for a few quick questions?
Hit me.
Okay, you come off as a very serious person. You're an investigative journalist with Bloomberg and you're talking to top people in Washington. But tell me 2 or 3 things people would be surprised to learn about you.
Oh, that's a great question. So people probably don't know that I was born in Germany. I didn't actually start speaking German until I was in college. I would say that I absolutely love to dance. I studied with the Royal School of Ballet as a young person and also danced in the DC area with a local dance club. People might not know that my father was a spy. He was a CIA operative and worked for 35 years for the Central Intelligence Agency. And when he retired, he was the head of the Eastern European and Soviet division. So he was a cold warrior. He had a big case involving a Polish colonel named Kuklinski, which has now become a book and a movie in Poland.
There we go. Secrets from Sarah Forton. Thank you. So one of the things that really surprises me when I come to Washington is there are so many people like you, children whose mother or father were spies. What are things that are common among people like you who grew up in a family of, I guess, secrecy or...
That's exactly the first thing I was going to say is that the profound impact of having a parent who was an intelligence officer is that it meant that we had a family secret. And that kind of informs a certain dynamic that a lot of children of CIA officers have talked about and written about. And in my case, my dad decided that when I turned 13, I was old enough to know what he did. And he told me what he did. And years later, when I asked him, why did you decide that I was old enough at 13 to understand? And he said, because I thought you were old enough to understand. But what he meant was I was old enough to understand that I needed to keep a secret, not old enough to actually understand what he did, because I was still very confused about what he did for many years after that.
So given that you grew up in a family where discernment was important, who you spoke with, what information you shared, how you conducted yourself, given the importance of your father's role, and like you said, the family secret. How has that affected your thinking or your skills as a journalist?
You know, what I didn't realize for a long time, because I thought I was going into a different kind of field than my father had been in. You know, I talked to him as a young college student, you know, should I think about the State Department as a career, because that was also sort of part of his cover, and he did a lot of work in the State Department system. And what I realized was that I actually learned a lot from him about how to ask questions, how to judge people, how to evaluate their responses, how to build trust, how to get people so they felt comfortable talking with me. And I realized that I learned, even though my mom was the reporter and the writer in the family, my dad was too. But he also really showed me about engaging with people in a way that was successful.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. So, as I've mentioned to you, the most downloaded episode of Dear Constance was about creativity. And I was telling a story about how I have confused for most of my life the word artist and creative. And discovering myself and seeing myself and experiencing myself as a creative person has really changed the way I move in the world. And I got a lot of questions about that episode. And so my question to you is this: how is creativity a part of your work as an investigative journalist?
Wow, that's a great question. And I think that one of the most important things to me about being an investigative journalist is to try to see around the corners and see the things that are unseen and to try to shine a light on the things that we don't know. And that for me is the thing that gives me the spark of curiosity and trying to find the narrative that isn't the obvious narrative, but it's the narrative that is under the surface. And I think that the way that creativity plays in that is about figuring out what are going to be the clues to find that narrative and uncover that narrative. And so there may be clues that are hiding in plain sight and no one's connected the dots. There are clues about people who might be able to tell you that story, even if they don't actually know it directly. So when I encourage my reporters, because I'm also now in an editing role where I'm working with reporters and trying to guide them to how to discover these narratives. And so I'll say, well, think about the wise people on your beat or the wise people who know the story and ask them if you were in this particular situation, or if you know that person who is in that particular situation, what would they tell you? Often you get from these people who you wouldn't have expected, you get a roadmap.
So, how else does creativity figure at work?
Well, it's what you're doing right now. It's about asking the right questions. And so we do a lot of work in figuring out how to ask the right questions that will get us the stories and the answers that we're looking for. And it's really important how you phrase a question, starting from basics to try to phrase a question so you're not just getting a yes or no answer. So questions like, what does this process look like now? Where does this process lead? Not, is this deal going to get blocked? Yes or no?
Yes.
They might say, I don't know. And you've totally cut off a whole line of information that otherwise might be accessible.
So I guess another question I have for you around creativity is that when I think of the words investigative journalist, and I know that you're in a financially driven organization with rigorous rules and guidelines in terms of behavior and how you report and how you write, you're very much in a left brain mindset a lot of the day. So how do you nurture your own creativity outside of work? And does that influence your work in any way?
Oh, that's so important. And I have to say, I think that's something that I've really been able to develop more consciously as I've gotten older. I think as a younger journalist, I was more intuitive and just chasing everything without maybe as much thought. And as an older person, I make sure that I have time to clear my mind. And so, we've talked about this. I've developed a meditation practice, also thanks in large part to you. I've developed a yoga practice and a breathing practice. I'm working on reading things that I would never read. So for years, I was very hard to read things that weren't connected to work because I was reading so much at work. Now I'm very consciously trying to read things that are outside of work.
Why do you think that's important, or how does that inform your work as a journalist?
For me, it's very much about language and developing the ear and nurturing the ear because a lot of the way I write and think comes from my ear. And also having grown up speaking many different languages, it's important both to have the diversity of that experience, but also to have a very clear, strong ear for the English language.
Another question that I'm really curious about is, can you speak a little bit to what happened when you because you've worked so hard over these past years to develop your skills and your network and your expertise as an investigative journalist, what happened when you were pulled back into this whole world of the House of Gucci, which was written almost 20 years ago? Like, how did that part of your life and being pulled back into that story, which I know it's a business story, but it's also driven by a narrative around intrigue and family saga and Italy. How did that influence your life as a journalist, or how did you balance your old writer self with your current role as an investigative journalist?
That was such an interesting experience because initially it felt like um, a kind of a coming together, but also a clash of two really distinct parts of my life. So my chapter in Italy, 22 years writing about Italian business world and about these Italian fashion families, and then my life now in Washington, writing about big companies and policies and how power moves in Washington. And it was actually through my exploration of social media that I really worked to integrate these two sides of myself. It was fun. It was actually the ability to focus on how I was going to tell the narrative of this phase and this resurgence of this story that I was so connected to, but also let myself play with the visuals. So places in Milan that were central to the book, giving people a peek behind the scenes. And so in a way that became kind of a connective tissue that pulled these two worlds together.
That is so cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I could go on and on, but I wanted to have a quick, I wanted to speak because you are a creative person. Obviously, you have a whole history of being a creative person. And now you're in this very left brain, hard driving on the perch of what's happening in the world in Washington role, which takes up a lot of your time.
Well, I think you've hit really, I think in this exploration of creativity, you've hit something very important that took me a long time to realize. And for a long time, I thought that creativity was only expressed through the work. So through the book or through the article or through the painting. And what I realized is that creativity actually is in how we live. And it's in also what we cook for dinner or the shows we go see or the friends that we make or the way we dress. So it's actually goes through everything that we do.
Understanding that and thinking of myself that way has really changed my life in a really huge way. Well, thank you.
Thank you for your
I
great
love you.
questions.